Today's episode is mostly entertainment. I'm going to tell one of the crazier stories that's ever happened to me in my real estate career. There are some good lessons to stick around for the end, so make sure that you stick around. But I hope you guys enjoy. Last week, we found out the supposed seller of a house we had in contract to purchase was fraudulently trying to sell us that house. He didn't own it. And he had the same first and last name as the actual seller. He knew personal information about the seller, and for a little while convinced us that the person in the house, which we didn't know at the time was the actual seller, was a squatter, and we called the cops on the actual seller. And I'm going to tell you everything that happened, and I'll share what we learned so that you can identify quickly if you're being scammed. Who am I? My name is Ryan Rice. I am a full-time real estate investor. I did 40 deals last year. We have a few crazy stories like this, and I'll try and share all of them with you to ensure that you can try to prevent them from happening to you and your business. So here's the chain of events. And by the way, the story is littered with red flags. And in fact, very early on, I told my team, there might be at least a 30% chance that this house isn't his. But I'll share with you the story. You'll see why. And after the fact, there were so many red flags that it did not surprise me that we were trying to be scammed. So here's what happened. We reached out to him. This was in our cold call marketing channel. And he shared with us he wanted to sell because this was a rental property. It had been vacant for about 6 to 8 months. The property was passed down from his father. And he lived up in Northern Virginia. This property's in Richmond. Didn't want to deal with it. And one of the first things that kind of piques my interest is when I asked him what he wanted for the property, it was a pretty low asking price. So I wouldn't say is necessarily a red flag, but it's just the first piece of this puzzle that made me kind of go, that is interesting. And what was also very interesting, part of my sales process is I'm asking very specific questions about the house, right? What's the age of the roof? What's the age of the furnace? What's the plumbing, electrical, the basement? And what's so funny in hindsight is he shared incredible amounts of detail. I mean, the year that the HVAC was last replaced, the fact that he just put brand new brown carpets after the tenant left, the fact that the basement was a walkout basement and you could walk under it. I mean, he was just sharing all sorts of detail. And I think the fact that he was sharing so much detail about the situation is what prevented me from completely stopping this really, really early on. But I mean, there was such detail that he shared. It was clear that he was really good at making shit up in the middle of his story, or everything was kind of premeditated and he put a little bit of effort into it. But after we went through that part of the sales process, then there was a period where he was really difficult to get a hold of. And again, not that this was a red flag that I should have identified at the time, but if someone had significant motivation to sell a house, just spent about a half hour on the phone with me going through this long process, and then we can't get a hold of them, again, just another part of the process that didn't really align, right? So we finally got a hold of him. And what was interesting is when I got a hold of him, I kind of addressed like, hey, is everything okay? I just want to make sure, we're having trouble getting a hold of you. And what he said was another reason why I got kind of drawled in and I backed off a little bit. And so I was like, yeah, it's just been a little bit difficult to get a hold of you. I didn't know if maybe you reconsidered or didn't want to sell. And he said, no. He said, Ryan, we just been going through a lot. My 17-year-old daughter got hit by a school bus last year and her foot is really messed up and we just been back and forth in and out. And, when I made the comment to him and I said, hey, we just wanted to make sure you wanted to sell, there was enough part of the story that was making me question what was actually going on. And so I asked him about it in a very polite way. But when he told me the thing about his daughter's school bus, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm such an asshole. Like, he's not trying to ghost us. He's just going through a lot, right? That's at least what I told myself. And again, another kind of funky piece that it was very uncommon is when I told him what the property qualified for, instantly he was like, okay, I'm ready to sign on the dotted line. And I was like, oh, okay. It kind of caught me off guard. And so we hopped off. I put the purchase agreement together. We hopped back on the phone. And this is how I start the conversation, right? I don't send the purchase agreement until they're on the phone because I don't want to send the purchase agreement, then they read it, and then something happens and I can't get a hold of them. I want to have the opportunity to have them on the phone while the purchase agreement is emailed to their inbox so that I can talk to them about it. So he gets the purchase agreement. And I say, hey, did it come through? He's like, yeah, I got it. And I said, okay, great. Just click this button. And when it pops up, you'll see sales contract for real estate at the top. And when that pops up, just give me a shout and I'll walk us through it. And I paused. And it was literally within 15 seconds, I got an email back in my inbox that it was signed. And I said, I think I just got it back signed. Did you mean to do that? He's like, yeah, I'm just ready to be done with this. And I said, okay, well, I typically like to walk my sellers through. I want to make sure that you're completely comfortable with everything. This was the first time in all of the deals I've done where exactly that scenario happened. And so I wasn't necessarily prepared in hindsight. But obviously this was probably the first big red flag, right? So a lot of interesting events that led up to this point. And within 60 to 90 seconds of having on the phone, I had the contract back signed and we hadn't even discussed it. And that had never happened in all of the seller deals that I've done. So then as we progress forward, I wanted to personally walk this house. It was such a good deal. We got it under contract at a very, very low price, probably about 50%, close to 50% of what it was going to be worth after we fixed it up. And after talking with him, at least based on the information he gave me, it didn't sound like it was in terrible shape. Of course, now I know the information he gave me was all fabricated. But based on what he told me, I was like, wow, this is going to be a really good deal. So I want to go personally see it. And what we had talked about is we arranged, he was up in Northern Virginia. This property was in Richmond. And I asked him, how can I get access? He said he would drive down over the weekend, leave the key in the mailbox, and then I could get in. So I get to the house on Monday and I open the mailbox, and it's one of those, like, the mailbox has an opening on the front and then it also has an opening on the back. I open the front. There's like a few pieces of mail. I'm looking in the mailbox. I don't see a key. I go to the back. I don't see a key. I'm like checking all around. I'm like, man, did I drive all the way out here? And he didn't tell me that there was no key. But what was interesting, my transaction coordinator followed up with him and he confirmed, yeah, I left the key. So I'm like looking everywhere for it. I'm thinking, what in the world is going on? And so then I thought, well, I wonder if he told my transaction coordination team that he left the key, but maybe he just left the door unlocked. So I walk up to the front door. Of course, I knock, ring, and nobody's there. I was like, well, let me see if he left the door unlocked. So sure enough, I hit the door. It was one of those, it wasn't a knob. It was one of those where you grab with your fingers and press with your thumb on the top and it opens. So it's one of those. I press it and sure enough, it opens. And I open the door. Hello. I scream, hello. It was very clear that nobody was home. And in hindsight, I'm glad nobody was home because I could have gotten shot. And in the future, what I am going to do, I will not ever go in a house again until I have a conversation with the seller and have clarity around what the access is. Now, I guess I could have called him and he could be like, oh, yeah, just, is it unlocked? Go inside. But that's at least an extra step I'm going to take going forward. In hindsight, I should have talked to him before I went in the house. So just for you and out there, like, make sure you gain clarity around that type of situation before you go in the house. So when I walked this house, there was stuff everywhere. And this was another like red flag or, hey, this is a little weird. Anyway, that is 6 to 8 months old. There would be bugs. I mean, it would have been absolutely filthy. And so my thought was, I think this tenant told him he moved out and he didn't look, and the tenant is still here. So I convinced myself that that is what was going on. Hey, this tenant, the tenant told him he left. The tenant actually never left. And I'm walking around in this house. And for those of you that follow me on Instagram, at the Ryan Rice, by the way, I posted pictures. I mean, there was one room had a server rack. It was like a 4 foot tall server rack in it, and it was running. Right, there was an active ring system where I like flipped a switch, and there was a ring system inside. There was a 3D printer that like vented to one of the windows. I mean, there was like a full on operation. It was clear that somebody was working out of that bedroom. I go into another bedroom and there's a flight simulator sitting on the floor of one of the bedrooms. And this thing looked legit, right? It didn't look like a video rocker or a video game rocker or anything like that. This looked like a legitimate flight simulator. And I'm looking around on the shelf. I'm seeing like a box for a piece of a flight simulator. And then there's this other box for a piece. And I mean, this looks like a serious setup. So I'm thinking, like, man, there is some wild operation going on, or someone's got some really cool entertainment type stuff. And then in the other bedroom, someone clearly has some sort of operation going on. And I was very thrown back. And so that was the next red flag. And as you can see, there's been plenty of them already. So when I left the house, I clearly didn't know what was going on. Was like, wow, yeah, I think the tenant is still here. I call the seller and I tell him what's going on. And the seller, he just responded, interesting. Very interesting. Right. And then I asked him, well, what do you think is going on? And without hesitation, instantly he was like, well, they must be squatters. And I thought in the back, I'm like, squatters. And I said, well, have you been in the house since the last tenant left? You mentioned that they vacated 6 to 8 months ago. Have you been to the house to verify that they left? And he was like, yeah, I was there. The place was empty. And so once he told me that, I was like, oh, okay. He says they're squatters. The only logical scenario is squatters, not the fact that there's 10 red flags already that he's given me and that he's completely full of shit. But I was like, okay, well, every squatter scenario I'm used to seeing is needles, drugs. There's the house is usually completely trashed. There's usually signs of forced entry. There was none of that. Right. So I was like, okay, well, this is one of the most interesting squatter situations I've ever seen. And then I start to have these stories running through my head of like, okay, we got a flight simulator, we got a network rack. Is this squatter like wanted by the FBI? I mean, I am really telling myself these stories. And, it's so funny about all this. And in hindsight, one thing that the fake seller did is we have a process that our title company goes through where they have to where the seller has to send in personal information through an authorization form. That's how the title company does stuff like request a mortgage payoff and confirm all of the title details. But one of those steps is the seller has to send in a copy of their driver's license. So we have a copy of the driver's license from fake seller and his social security number. And in hindsight, I'm thinking, man, this fake seller unfortunately doesn't have a ton of intelligence because we know where he lives. We have his social. He really thought we were going to go through and give him this money. And then I thought to myself, well, man, if his intelligence is extremely low, I'm not sure what that says about me and my intelligence because he convinced me that the house was his. But anyway, lots of red flags here going on, right? So he told me there was a squatter and it was a story that sounded okay enough in my head that we would continue to pursue. And so I called my eviction attorney and I'm like, hey, we got a situation. Told my eviction attorney. My eviction attorney, by the way, was like, holy shit, that is wild. That's interesting. But he told me what needed to happen. And one thing that he told me is like, hey, your next steps, we got to bring the cops out and confront the squatter. And so I call the seller, I'm doing air quotes, back, and I tell him, hey, talk to my eviction attorney. We need to go to the house with the cops. I was like, I know you're up in Northern Virginia. I'm more than happy to volunteer to do that for you. Right. Because again, this deal was so good that I wanted to do everything in my power to still try and make sure that it could close. It would have been worth going through some wild squatter scenario to still be able to close on the deal. And by the way, in the very beginning, I told my team, I was like, man, this deal is really good. And after he signed without having to go through the contract, I told my team, I was like, this seems a little too good to be true. And usually when things seem too good to be true, they actually are. But let's see if we can get it to the finish line. So I had some signs in the beginning, but there were just so many misaligned events and the way that he communicated the details about the house. And he talked about going through a divorce. Like he just said so many things. It's like, okay, well, he gave me enough information that I was like, all right, let's keep going forward. So, anyways, I told him I talked to my eviction attorney. We got to go get the cops out. So it's like, all right, we actually three-wayed with the cops. And I said, I led the conversation. Hey, Mr. Cop, we have a situation. I have, Mr. Seller here on the line. Mr. Fake Seller spoke to the cops and we think that there's squatters in this house. I'm local. He's not. He's authorized me to meet you out there, but we need to go confront the squatter. So I got an officer on the line. The officer's like, all right, I'll meet you out there in 30 minutes. And luckily I looked at my calendar and I could go out there. So here we go, right? I'm on my way. I go out to this house and I'm supposed to meet the cops there in a half hour. Well, I get there and I wait a little bit and the cops don't show up. So it's like, well, this is like super weird. If there's squatters in there, the neighbors have to have seen something. So I see like a neighbor walking around outside. I'm sitting there waiting for the cops. It's like, I don't know how long that's going to take. I get out and I go talk to the neighbor. And I talk to the neighbor and the neighbor's like, yeah, I don't really know. I haven't seen any suspicious activity. I haven't seen the seller for a while. They talked about the seller. They didn't know much about him, but they mentioned that they just hadn't seen him for a while. Hey, he's got this truck, but yeah, it's been a little bit. And so there wasn't information that was shared with me that would be concrete enough to really do anything with. And again, keep in mind, I'm thinking that I'm finding out information about the squatter that's there. And based on what they said, they didn't see anything suspicious. But and the neighbor, this poor lady, she probably was in her 80s. And I didn't give a lot of credence to maybe some of the information that was shared. So then I saw another neighbor across the street, this was an elderly gentleman. Same thing. Hey, I represent the seller for this house behind me, and he suspects that they're squatters. Have you noticed anything suspicious? And we start talking. Nobody notices anything suspicious. I'm like, okay, well, we don't really have much. Um, and I finished talking to the neighbors. I go back in my truck, and the cops still aren't here. So I call the cops. Oh, sorry, they had a higher priority call. You got pushed out. Um, we'll we still have you on our list, but we're not quite sure. I can't give you a time. Like, okay. Well, meanwhile, when I was on my way to the property, there was enough weird going on that I called the title company. I was like, "Hey, title company, can you send me a copy of the driver's license? Because I just like I've talked to these neighbors. Maybe I can show the picture of the driver's license to the neighbors and be like, "Hey, is this the seller?" And so they sent me a copy of the driver's license. I get back out of my car. I go talk to the neighbors. I show them the driver's license, and they say, "Yeah, that guy doesn't look familiar." I was like, "Okay, well, if there's a squatter in the house, that would make sense." It didn't connect to me that the owner is living there, and this guy doesn't look familiar, but because he is scamming me out of the house. So there was nothing that really came out of that. And then I got back into my car and I get an email from the title company. And the email from the title company says, "Hey, Ryan, we did a background check on the seller. The seller's name is, Mr. Blank Seller. And the person that we're talking to is Mr. Blank Seller. And the first and the last name were the exact same, spelled this exact same, but the middle names were different." And title said, and by the way, this seller is born in 1983. This seller is born in 1976. And I said, okay, something is funky. This is too many things that are funky enough. And so I called the police department and I said, hey, can you just cancel the call? And we canceled the call and I left. So I think I got a hold of the seller the next day and I said, hey, so my title company had a few questions and they they pointed out that the name that's on title is Mr. Blank Seller, and you are Mr. Blank Seller, and the middle name is different. And this Mr. Blank Seller is born in blank of whatever month in 1976, but you're born in whatever month in 1983. Can you explain that? And he said, well, yeah, the person that you said is on title, that is my sister's ex-husband, but he shouldn't be on title. I should be on title because they got divorced. And when they got divorced, she got the house in the divorce, and then she didn't want the house, so she gave it to me. And I mean, his answer was like, boom, quick. And I'm obviously at this point, when I called him, I was probably like, okay, unless there was some sort of name change, 80% chance this guy is completely full of shit and we're being, led on to believe that he owns the house and he doesn't. 20% chance maybe something funky is going on and he actually owns it. So then when he spit that out super quick, I went back to, I was like, what in the world is happening? I was like, I think I'm being punked right now. But my brain went back towards like a 50-50. And again, in hindsight, when I pull myself out of the situation and I look at all the red flags, I should have never came back to 50-50. But he spit that out so quickly that I got title back on the phone and I said, hey, he this is what he told me. Can we just make sure that the information that we're getting is accurate? So then while I had him on the phone as well, I asked him about the mortgage. Well, hey, Mr. Seller, when we talked about the house, you mentioned it was free and clear, but there's a mortgage, and the mortgage is in the name of your sister's ex-husband. How do you explain that? And he said, well, yeah, I don't know. I can't explain it, but the house was passed to me, and as far as I know, there's no mortgage. And my eviction attorney said something when I was on the phone with him. He's like, yeah, one thing, it could have been a part of the divorce, and maybe the mortgage company just forgot to release the lien. And so when the seller told me, "Oh yeah, my sister, divorced her husband and then gave the property to me," immediately I thought, "Well, okay, I guess that's the one scenario. Maybe the scenario could be like my eviction attorney said, and the mortgage company just forgot to release the lien." And so there were just all these bizarre facts that lined up that made me detract from my like, okay, 80% this guy's completely full of shit. And so we went back to the title company. I told him everything. I recapped our conversation, and the title company was still skeptical, as they should have been. So the title company sent me an email with a screenshot of the ex-wife in a social media account. And the ex-wife was Caucasian. And remember, we have a driver's license of the guy who's talking to us, who's representing himself as the seller, who told us that that's his sister. And this guy is African American. So sister is Caucasian, he's African American. My brain immediately went like, okay, this guy's completely full of shit. And then my brain, because it's so intelligent, it immediately told me, well, hey, don't be so insensitive. There's a possibility that he could be black, she could be white, and they could still be siblings. All right. And so I listened to that part of my brain for a little bit. And I was like, okay, let's just dig a little bit further and actually get to the bottom of it. If I just need to go talk to the ex-husband, I need to figure out a way to get a hold of him. So I go do my own research on social media. I find the ex-wife on social media. And then I told myself, I was like, okay, if she was divorced at some point, I'm going to scroll through her social media and I'm going to be able to see pictures of the actual dude. Right. And luckily, this woman's social media was public. A lot of her pictures, a lot of that stuff was public. So I'm scrolling. Finally, many, many years ago, I see a picture of her with a dude, and the dude was Caucasian. And I said, that's got to be him. So I kept scrolling. Sure enough, I saw a tag of this dude, and I click on his name, and I'm scrolling through this guy's photos, and I can see a picture of this guy that in the background is like a small portion of this house. So I was like, well, that's the confirmation that I need. This is the actual seller, and the person that I'm talking to is completely full of shit. And I feel like a complete idiot because I had been led on after red flag after red flag after red flag. And so I actually reached out to the guy. He responded. We actually had a conversation on the phone. He was very disturbed. I think he was in shock by the whole thing. He appreciated me reaching out and giving him all of the information, but he definitely had some big concerns about what had transpired. He filed a police report. He may also sue. We'll see what happens. But one of the wildest situations, we have had someone try to sell us a house that wasn't theirs before. So this is the second time that that's happened. But the first time, we found out pretty quickly that it wasn't the actual seller because that guy didn't have information about the real seller and he wasn't as quick. And again, this guy was quick with detailed information and knew that the guy was divorced and was like, yeah, that's my sister. And there were red flags all along the way that shouted and shouted and shouted. But then there would be these little conversations that happened that would bring me back to the potential possibility. And of course, I really didn't want to lose the deal because it was going to be a really, really good deal. So that in and of itself kept me in the game as well. But here's what I think happened. And for those of you that run direct to seller marketing, if you run a cold calling channel, this is something I think you should be aware of. Because fake seller had the exact first and last name as real seller, what happened is when the cold calling data, and I pay for good data. I pay for I use DataFlick. And when this data, I guess, got pulled because the names were similar, we got information about fake Mr. Seller and it corresponded to real Mr. Seller because the names were so similar. So my guess, I would be willing to make a very, very large bet that fake seller was getting call after call after call about wanting to sell this house that wasn't his. And my bet is that it happened so much that he said to himself one day, he's like, screw this, I'm actually going to try to sell this house. And I was the person who he decided to do that with. And maybe he's tried it with others as well. And my guess is he'll try it again unless the real seller scares the shit out of him, which I think he intends to do. But that's the story that I'm making up in my head. Of course, I can't validate that. But if I have this data and I got a hold of him and my team got a hold of him, my guess is that was not the first time that happened. And it probably happened so many times. And all it takes is for him to be a little bit of annoyed and also be kind of a shitty person and to put this plan together to try and, get the money. And another big red flag, or at least something that stood out immediately after he signed this authorization form from our title company that I talked about previously, he was like, yeah, so the house is yours now, right? And I was like, no, that's not how it works. We got to go to closing. You remember what we talked about when we discussed the house? So, we're going to close in 2 to 3 weeks. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. And then he also asked, he's like, say, how do I get the deposit? And I was like, yeah, the deposit goes to the title company. Now, that's not the first time someone's asked, how do I get the deposit? And, people that have asked that in the past have actually been real sellers. So I wasn't completely thrown off. But again, the number of red flags in this deal, there was probably over 10 things that were like, oh, that's weird. Okay, that's a little weird. And there were some things that certainly didn't add up. So the learnings that I have is if you have an outbound lead and it seems a little sketchy, then it likely could be sketchy and it warrants a little bit more research. The second thing, if you have a lot of red flags, then it's likely that it's just a big red flag. And it, at a minimum, warrants more research before you put in more work. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. And until the next one, I'll see you. Peace.